Okay, let's get started. Good evening. My name is Barrett Jones, and this tonight's webinar is how a synthesizer works. Uh, I am a musician and a music educator based in Washington, D.C. I run a portable digital synthesizer music lab called Beat Club, which travels from uh, around the city to schools, community centers, libraries, teaching music to kids using synthesizers. And tonight I'm going to talk about the basics of how a synthesizer works. This presentation is meant for educators who want to communicate some basic concepts and aspects of synthesizers to students. Um, this material can be found, of course, in many other places and is obviously the domain of experts with PhDs. So what this does tonight is to give some key phrases and definitions of how a synthesizer works and the components of a synthesizer. Just a very brief outline which as an educator you can convey to your students. Um, Also, if in the future this webinar is being viewed by a student, this is a good general outline for the basics of how a synthesizer works. So for educators, this is material which you can convey to students, and for students, this is some basic material. Um, After the introduction, we're going to talk about types of synthesis. We'll look at definitions of analog versus digital synthesizers. And then we'll get into the components of synthesizers. We'll look at the oscillator, filter, envelope, controls, the interface, and then we'll uh, summarize what we covered tonight. So a lot of information, a lot of terms tonight, um, but there will be a summary at the end. So here's a diagram of a basic synthesizer. There are, of course, many variations, but essentially a synthesizer takes the input from a keyboard or some other um, controller, and this input triggers an oscillator which generates sound waves. The oscillator, the signal then passes through a filter or set of filters and is then sent to an amplifier and then output as sound through a speaker. You see that during this process a modulator can also affect the signal either through the oscillator, filter, or amplifier. And then there are other global controls, and we'll look at some of those later on, that also affect the input and the output. But essentially, we're going to think about the components of a synthesizer as being the oscillator, the filters, um, and what we're going to call envelope, and then controls and interfaces. So synthesizers or forms of mechanical electronic instruments that produce sound have been around for a long time, but sort of most people think of the first synthesizer as being the RCA Mark II sound synthesizer in 1957, and there's a picture of it. It took up a large part of a room, and it basically worked the same as modern day synthesizers. And those rolls of paper you see are somewhat like the old piano rolls or computer punch cards that were fed through player pianos. Bob Moog, and we'll talk about the history of synthesizers in more detail in another webinar that I'm developing for next month. But Bob Moog, here pictured with one of his Moog synthesizers, was an early pioneer in creating the modern analog synthesizer, um, and we'll take a look at the components now of the types of synthesis, sound synthesis. Additive synthesis creates timbre, and we've heard about timbre in the last week's webinar, where we discussed timbre being essentially the combination of tones and overtones that produce the unique sound of an instrument. In other words, uh, the, the note E played on a guitar sounds different from the note E played on the piano. Even though these are the exact same notes, the timbre differs. Additive synthesis in the world of synthesizers is was an early form of synthesis. Um, so things like there was a device called the teleharmonium and some other early synthesizers or synthesizer-like examples of instruments. And these use the process of additive synthesis, where sound waves were combined to create a timbre. Uh, More recent synthesizers all use subtractive synthesis, which creates the timbre by altering the sound waves. So instead of combining the sound waves to adding sound waves to produce a certain timbre, um, the sound waves are altered by the synthesizer in subtractive synthesis to create the timbre. And then there is a third basic type of synthesis called frequency modulation synthesis, um, which creates the timbre by modulating the frequency of the sound waves. And we talked last week about sound waves and different types of sound waves. So we'll not get into the physics of sound so much this time, uh, but these are the three types of synthesis in synthesizers. Subtractive synthesis is by far the most well-known and widely used synthesis. So in the world of synthesizers, there basically is a divide between the analog and digital. The early synthesizers were analog, and this continued up through the 70s, and then in the 80s, as technology advanced, digital synthesizers became available. Today, there are both analog and digital synthesizers available. Um, and there are many, it's more a matter of personal choice, really, preference of analog versus digital. Here's a quote from Bob Moog, um, who we saw the picture of earlier, the developer of really the modern synthesizer. And here Moog is talking about the difference between analog and digital. And he says, it's called analog because the way electricity vibrates in the circuit is analogous to the way sound vibrates in an acoustic instrument. You get a smooth waveform that's more natural and more of what our ears expect than what you get out of digital circuitry. What you get out of digital are steps, because each very small slice of time is defined by a number. And as you go from one slice of time to the next, the number changes and you get these steps. The steps are smoothed out, but the effect of them is always there to one extent or another. So you hear the difference. So probably a nice way to sort of picture this is with analog, there's one smooth line of sound, and with digital, there's many, many points along a line. And because the digital is always breaking the sound down to ones and zeros, whereas the analog, the signal is uninterrupted, and digital, the signal is interrupted. Not really perceptible to the human ear, but there is a difference. And so here's some definitions. Analog synthesizers use sound generating circuits to produce a continuous audio signal. Digital synthesizers use digital process to convert an audio signal to digital. The term digital signal processing is often used in terms of digital synthesizers. So that's kind of the basic breakdown of synthesizers, analog versus digital. The old synthesizers, the big machines that you see in old film clips and things, are all analog synthesizers. Um, and really there's been a resurgence and a rebirth of interest in analog synthesizers in the last 10 or so years. So the basic component of a synthesizer that generates the noise is called an oscillator. Um, an oscillator converts a direct current, a direct electricity current, into an alternating or oscillating current. That's essentially what it does. Um, a voltage-controlled oscillator, which is a typical oscillator, is just what it says. The voltage of electricity controls the oscillations of sound. Um, there are a couple of different types of oscillators. The first one is called a harmonic oscillator. A harmonic oscillator produces a sine wave. We learned in the last week's webinar that there are some fundamental types of sound waves, and sine waves are are waves that are generated by acoustic instruments. And with the harmonic oscillator, the sine waves generated are those which are essentially harmonious. There is a second type of oscillator called a relaxation oscillator. And this oscillator produces different shaped sound waves. It produces square waves, triangle waves, and sawtooth waves. And these waves are only found in electronic instruments. Uh, and they have a much different sound than a sine wave. There is another type of oscillator. It's called a low frequency oscillator. But this oscillator, unlike the other two, really operates as a secondary oscillator. And it operates at a low frequency, hence its name, typically below 20 hertz. And 20 hertz is a measure of frequency that is basically below the threshold of hearing for human beings. So this lower frequency is used as a control frequency to modulate another component's value, changing the sound without introducing another source. So essentially a low frequency oscillator can be used in combination with another oscillator or other filters, which we'll talk about soon, to change the sound. But since it's at a low frequency, the waves generated by the low frequency oscillator cannot be heard. So it's only the oscillations are changing the signal, but the signal itself, um, the signal emanating from the low frequency oscillator, can't be heard. So we've talked about the oscillator, which is the sound generating piece of the synthesizer. Now let's take a look at the different types of filters that are in a synthesizer. A filter is a circuit that responds differently to electrical signals of different frequencies. And so there's essentially a voltage control filter, which oftentimes on synthesizers you see the initials or the abbreviation VCF. Voltage controlled filter varies the cutoff frequency by using input voltage. That is, the amount of voltage coming in uh, will vary than the frequency that is being passed through or cut off. And we'll take a look now at the four common filters: low pass, high pass, band pass, and notch. Low pass filters take the low frequency range the low frequency harmonic elements and allow them to pass through and still be heard. But the low pass filter filters out the high frequency harmonic elements and does not allow them to pass through. So essentially a low pass filter will filter out the high frequency elements and pass through the low frequency elements of a signal. A high pass filter would do the opposite. It will allow the high pass frequencies to come through the filter while eliminating the low frequencies. It's the opposite of a low pass filter. A band pass filter takes the mid frequencies, those frequencies which are in the range between the low and high, and passes them through while preventing the low and high frequencies from passing through. So something like a graphic equalizer, for example, will allow you to manipulate low, mid, and high frequencies in the way that these filters do. So if you ever use a graphic equalizer, essentially you are using a filter. There's a fourth type of filter called a notch filter, and it's also called a band reject filter. It leaves the high and low frequencies unaltered while reducing the volume of the frequencies in between the high and low. So it's essentially acting as a combined low-pass, high-pass filter. So now let's move on to talk about the envelope. So when you think about what's happening so far, we have the oscillator, which is using which depending on the electrical current is generating a sound. The sound, audio signal, the audio signal is being passed through filters which can emphasize the low frequencies or the high frequencies or the mid frequencies. But now before just going out directly to an amplifier, the sound is sent through a series of envelopes. And these envelopes help further control the sound. This is commonly referred to as an envelope shaper or an envelope generator. With envelopes, there is a common acronym called ADSR, which you'll see a lot. And ADSR are the four types of commonly used envelopes: attack, decay, sustain, and release. Attack is the time given, or rather the time taken for the initial run-up of sound level from silence to the peak sound, beginning when the sound is first triggered. So essentially, when you think about pressing the key on a synthesizer, my finger presses the key, and the attack is going to be that space of time between when I first hear the sound, or when I first press the key, until I hear the sound at its peak. That is the attack. The decay is the time it takes to run down from attack level to sustain level. So when you think about pressing that key, there's a certain amount of time when it comes up to the peak, and then it settles down to a sustaining level, which is below the peak level. And that's the decay from the peak down to the sustain level. Sustain is the level during the main sequence of the sound's duration. So I hit that note. First it goes up to the attack, takes it up to the peak, then the decay takes it down to sustain, and then the sustain is essentially the way it's sounding for the duration of the amount of time it takes for the sound to continue to travel. And then release is the time taken for the level to decay from sustain to zero. So in other words, release now is once I leave sustain and the sound fades out, that amount of time is the release. So all of these different envelopes can be controlled. They all have different parameters, so you can control the attack, the decay, the sustain, and the release of a note by modifying settings on these envelopes. Um, and then another thing to think about when we're thinking about envelopes is essentially the envelope is also where the amplifier is, where the sound is being amplified. A voltage controlled amplifier, VCA, is oftentimes a term you see. And with a VCA, the gain is set by the voltage level of a control signal. Um, it's it's also called a variable gain amplifier. So gain, or rather volume, is controlled by voltage. So let's take a quick tour through some controls on a synthesizer. These are various aspects of a synthesizer um, that musicians use to control various aspects. The first control is glide, sometimes called portamento, and controls the amount of time to slide from one note to another. If you think about the way that a flute sounds, or an instrument where the notes slide from one to another, in other words, there's no cut, there's no clearly defined point where one note ends and the other begins. That's glide. The pitch bender is found on many synthesizers as a pitch wheel, is sometimes called, which is an actual wheel next to the keyboard. And the pitch bender allows the pitch of a note to be taken down an octave or up an octave from that note, manually running this pitch wheel. Voices are another control that you see on synthesizers, and the voice of a synthesizer is the upper limit of the number of notes that can be played at a given time. And so if one can adjust the voice of a synthesizer, and by adjusting the voice, it adjusts the upper limit of the number of notes that can be played. And then unison is another control on a synthesizer, and unison is used to stack the voices, which we just learned of, with the unison voice being heard one octave above the frequency of the played note. So in other words, unison will take those different voices and it will stack them. Uh, it will stack those voices that are in unison one octave above the frequency of the played note. And then an arpeggiator, which is based on the musical technique of arpeggio, where notes in a chord are played or sung in a sequence rather than all together. On a synthesizer, the arpeggiator plays the notes at a master tempo. And that's found on many different types of synths. So let's talk now about the different interfaces that players use to generate, to essentially trigger oscillators. Um, the most widely known and still most widely used interface for playing a synthesizer is the keyboard. A piano keyboard here is an example of a keyboard on a Moog synthesizer. But there is also a device called a ribbon. And what that does is the player puts his or her finger on this device and it creates essentially a circuit that then by sliding the finger up and down the ribbon you can control the oscillator of the synthesizer. So sometimes you'll hear the term ribbon synthesizer, and that's what this is. It's, instead of a keyboard, it's a ribbon that the player moves the finger up and down. Wind is another controller, the breath, and this is used with synthesizers um, that are designed to sound like wind instruments. And so here is a fellow playing a wind synth, And so here the breath is the controller. It's actually the trigger for starting and stopping the oscillator. Buttons are common. Here is a old drum machine, and here the interface is essentially triggering different loops using by pressing buttons. Also, pads are used as triggers for synth drums. So here the player can play these drums just like a normal trap kit, but instead of the acoustic drums, these pads are sensors fed into a synthesizer. Um, and then finally, the touchpad, uh, found primarily on the Korg oscillators and chaos pads. And we'll talk. I've talked about these the oscillator and chaos pad in previous webinars, and I'm sure we'll touch on it again. This particular device, these touchpad synthesizers, are what I use in B Club, and I find these extremely useful for in terms of portability and also ease of use. Um, so we're closing in on the on a really a very full, fully uh, stacked webinar of terms about synthesizers. But I hope that this quick tour gave you at least some basic ideas about how a synthesizer works and some of the terms and some of the things to investigate further. Just reviewing what we covered, we looked at types of synthesis, additive, subtractive, and frequency modulation. We looked at different types of oscillators, really the harmonic and relaxation oscillator, and then the low frequency oscillator, which is actually used more as a modulator. Uh, we then looked at filters, the low pass filter, the high pass filter, the band pass, and notch. Um, Envelope with the abbreviation ADSR. So the envelope contains controls for attack, decay, sustain, and release, which all relate to the duration um, and peak of a note when it's played. And controls such as glide, or sometimes called portamento, the pitch bender, which bends the pitch, the voices, unison, arpeggiator. All these are different controls um, which can which are triggered both at input and output of sound, but are kind of external to essentially what's going on in the synthesizer. They're just manipulating the sound that's coming out. And then we had a quick tour of the different interfaces available in a synthesizer for synthesizers, um, including the keyboard, ribbon, winds, button, pad, touchpad, and I suppose really I should also have included something like a smartphone, like an iPhone, because, for example, you can download a Moog synthesizer or a Korg synthesizer, I guess I should emphasize that, and have it as an app on your iPhone. So these days, synthesizers are available on devices as small as your phone, and it's quite a change from that picture we saw of that 1957 synthesizer that took up half a room. So thank you for listening tonight. If you have any questions or concerns, you can email me, barrett@dcbclub.com. I'd love to hear from you. And this is the last webinar for February. Next month we'll be looking into more of the history of synthesizers and go deeper into examples of synthesizers. But that's it for tonight. So thank you very much. Have a good